In this lesson, we're going to write Ruby programs to produce and consume messages with Kafka. To start off, we need to install the Kafka gem. Now that it's installed, let's write a short Ruby program to publish messages to Kafka. So we require Kafka, and we instantiate a producer. Now when we instantiate the producer, there are a few arguments that we can pass it. First, we can pass it the host. Then we can pass it the port. And if you don't define these arguments, these are the defaults, the local host and port 9092. Then we tell it what topic we're going to be publishing to. Let's publish to BigData. Finally, we want to specify the partition that we're going to be publishing data on. We'll get to what the partition means in a later lesson. For now, let's just publish to partition 0. Okay, let's put some output here so we know that it's running. Producer, topic. So we see the topic is accessible. And you can actually define that while the program is running. You can assign different topics to it and then send messages, which we'll do later. So let's just send 10 messages real quick. We use a Kafka message, and anything we define here is the payload of the message. So we'll just say, let's just send it a string. Often you'll want to send as that string, say JSON or something that you can serialize objects with and deserialize later. All right, and finally we send to the producer. So let's see if this runs. So it seemed to run, but we can't tell if it did anything. To see if it did anything, let's check the output that we are directing to the kafka.out file. So here we see it actually created a log for BigData, which was the topic that we defined. And 0 is the partition. It registers the topic in Zookeeper so that it can track it later. And here's where we exit out. So now let's write a consumer in Ruby to see messages that come through. All right, this time we're going to define a consumer. As before, we can specify the host and the port. We specify the topic, BigData, and we specify the partition that we're consuming messages from. Now, let's just loop on messages that come through. So consumer object has a method that helps us do that. Loop message. Loop, which takes a block and yields messages that come through. Messages is an array of message objects. and payload is the raw string that we passed in. So let's run this consumer and see what happens. All right, it seems to be running, but we can't really tell. Let's go back to the producer and send some messages through. And here we see the messages came through. So for those of you who are familiar with queuing systems, you might be wondering why, when I started the consumer, it didn't get the messages that had previously been sent. For instance, if I send some messages now, and we start the consumer, we won't get anything. But if I send messages while it's running, we'll get those messages. That's because in Kafka, it's up to the consumers to keep track of where they are in the message queue. To do that, you need to keep track of a variable called an offset. When you initialize the consumer, and actually at any point while it's running, you can manually set the offset yourself. So here, let's set the offset to 0 and see what happens. Okay, when we set the offset to 0, we see that we're getting all those messages that were previously published. So we went once, and another time, so we see every time the producer was called. That's, again, the nature of Kafka being persistent. Offset is really just a byte location in a log file, and it replays that log file for you. That's why when we looked at the Kafka output, it said it was creating a log file for BigData. One other thing to note about consumers in Kafka is that they operate on a pull mechanism. That is, the Kafka broker won't automatically push messages down to the consumer. So let's modify the consumer a little bit to see what that looks like. So here we're calling consumer.loop. Let's look at the underlying implementation of the loop method to get an idea for what the Kafka consumer is doing. I have the Kafka gem code pulled up on GitHub. Okay, let's find the consumer and find loop. Okay, so here we see it's defining messages, and it's just endlessly calling this method consume, and then it's yielding to our block the messages that it pulled down, and then it just sleeps for some interval, some polling interval. So again, that's the pull mechanism. Kafka won't automatically send messages down to the consumers. They actually have to hit it and request messages from a given offset. So if we just call consume, we should get a block of messages. Let's modify the consumer to call consume instead of an endless loop. All right, so we're calling consume and assigning the result to messages and looping through the messages and outputting them. Let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so we can see here that we're still getting all those messages. So consume actually gets an array of messages. The question is, why are we getting this many? Well, we set the offset to 0, so we'd expect to start from the very beginning of the file. So the consumer, when it calls consume, actually has another argument that it sends to Kafka. Let's look at the implementation of consume to see what that is. So here we need to look at send consume request. There it is, max size. So that's what we're sending to Kafka: the topic, the partition, the offset, and the max size. If we look at the consumer, it defines a default max size of a megabyte. Now, since the messages we were publishing weren't that big, we got all of them in one go. If we want to limit that, we'll have to define the max size ourselves. So let's update this to define the max size. And let's just say we want to look for 50 bytes. And run the consumer again. And there we see we only got the first 2 messages. In this lesson, we've learned how to write a basic producer that sends messages to Kafka, and how to write a consumer that can consume those messages. We've also learned about how Kafka uses offsets with the consumers to determine where to pull from the queue. And we've used the polling mechanism to pull messages off.